Just need to start this video with a content warning. The Sinking City has lots of stuff in it that you may not gel with, including at its worst, severe depictions of the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings, but also references to colonialism and the horrors attached to places like Africa and South America as a result of it. Plus a dog does die in a really horrible way. Anyway, very influential horror author and noted racist H.P. Lovecraft is an author you've either read and told people about to look knowledgeable, or you haven't read but still told others to look knowledgeable. A number of his works have entered the zeitgeist, and his name carries a similar weight as calling something Kafkaesque, even if you don't know what that means. His works focus on the horror of not knowing, or the alienation we feel. I haven't actually read them. The Sinking City taps into this, as it was originally going to be a licensed Cthulu game before the start of a very long development that eventually saw it become its own thing, which was still taken away from them since their distributing partner claimed ownership of the game they didn't actually develop. To cut it short, this game had some fun legal battles going on, and it was delisted and relisted in some shenanigans I don't want to get into. Just know that the development themselves, and the eventual self-publishment after the aforementioned shenanigans, was all handled by Frogwares, a studio in the Ukraine which has been going strongly since the early 2000s. Primarily they developed PC adventure games, some of which used the Sherlock Holmes license. They knew their niche and they made it work for them, but later on they wanted to try bigger, more complicated games, a method they're still sticking to now, given their modern Sherlock Holmes games on current-gen systems and the Switch, the newest of which is a Holmes and Cthulhu story. They really know their niche, good on them. But the first game they wanted to break it big with was 2019's The Sinking City, which is very much described as an indie-budgeted adventure game reaching for a AAA status. The game is definitely not super high budget, and there is quite a bit of jank, but they pulled it off if you just keep your expectations in check. Also, I'm playing the Switch version specifically, which is a good facsimile of the console version if you put it through a cheese grater and covered it in Vaseline, and then filled it with lots of fade-in, because they can't render all the decorations more than a few meters away. It's the usual Switch port of the modern game, and very little is compromised here technically, though it isn't the smoothest ever experience, and loading isn't the quickest thing either. But hey, they did a good job. This Switch version was still developed by Frogwares, and they even did the publishing, so good on them. They didn't have big publisher money behind them, and it was released on Switch only 3 months after the other releases. So this is still a very good port. And best of all, they even included gyro on the Switch, so this goes in the list of good games where Serious Sam on Switch isn't welcome. I was about to start at the beginning of the game, but there's something I need to go into even before that. The game has some minor DLC, nothing substantial, but I'd also be lying if I said I didn't like the exclusive clothes it adds, and all the other missions too, I guess. They're cheap and I got them on sale with the rest of the game, so I won't complain about these cheap, needless goodies. But I will pivot and complain about the free DLC. It adds a gold skin to the Tommy gun weapon, which is fine. It's all a matter of taste. And while I'm not super opposed to the flair here like others are, it is still a bold choice in a deliberately drab game about hopelessness. The issue is more so it gives the player a Tommy gun at the very beginning of the game, one that can't be unequipped without uninstalling this DLC, which I have now discovered is a pain to do on Switch. This is a super late game weapon, and it kills the tension the early game excelled in. But if you want to do that for some reason, you're covered, but perhaps avoid the tempting free DLC Tommy gun. Downloadable content notwithstanding, the opening is a sublime slice of what the larger game will offer, for better and worse. It is still a glorified tutorial, but you'll get an immediate grasp of the bulk of the game in microcosm. We play as Charles Reed, a former Navy diver from the Great War. It's now sometime in the 1920s, and Reed has set up shop as a private detective in Baltimore, and he has since travelled by ship to the recently flooded Oakmont, a strange town that keeps much to itself and is distrustful of outsiders. Oakmont residents are primarily human beings as we know them, though there is a refugee crisis from the nearby Innsmouth, and it has changed those demographics, as well as incited a lot of racism, discrimination, and other things which are so easy to parallel to our real world. I figured the game wouldn't go any further with depicting inexcusable hatred, but no, as I mentioned, the clan and our world's issues are still very much issues in this 1920s fictional world. Also, among the denizens of a secluded town is Robert Throgmorton, who is one of the most powerful figures in this town due to his family lineage. He's old money and he's happy to flaunt it with very not so tasteful decorations. He's also not completely human, and the less said the better, though the game is happy to spell it out for you and with not great implications. His father certainly loved taking pieces of Africa back with him. The reason for Reed's choice to visit this bizarre locale after a flood is because of his chronic nightmares and visions. He was called here to investigate others with similar issues, and to hopefully put an end to all of this. If the Innsmouth residents and the Gorilla Man weren't enough to clock in the weirdness of the town for you, the rest of it certainly will. This is a locale of multiple cults, cruel torture enacted as justice, and all kinds of supernatural oddities, including the recent infestation of scary monsters that want you dead. But there's also cute monsters too, and they won't harm you. Despite this town, which I know practically speaking is a lot of software generated streets with buildings being duplicated, it is still a town I felt very immersed in. Like sure, practically speaking it's all set dressing, most areas serve little to no purpose, and I can see the argument that thinks this is padding and would want a tighter, smaller map. In a lot of games I would agree, but the devs here managed to make a world built on the history and lore of this town. And if you go in with the expectations of it being an indie game, unlike anything they had developed to that point, the map really does sell this wonderfully, and it makes everything feel more alive. They even went to the effort to mocap background details like mugging that serve no purpose here. You can tell they were passionate. In addition to all that, we have lots of districts here that give you a good understanding of the demographics before the calamity. When a character says someone is from Reed Heights, or Old Grove, or Salvation Harbor, you know exactly what kind of background or status they have. And this world is complete with lots of neat advertisements from before the flood, and we even get statues and memorials really depicting the past here. You really get a sense of identity, and that's not even including the massive architectural differences or the cleanliness. Not surprisingly, the most affected areas by the flood, complete with mud everywhere, are the poorest areas, and the least affected is the old money hotspot of Old Grove. You'll get a good understanding of a town here, and all of the locales inside of it, because navigation is half the game here. But let's return to the other half so people don't get the impression this game is nothing more than a glorified map. The game, like the protagonist, wears many hats, but at the core of its gameplay is investigating specific locations. This is nothing new, it's pretty boilerplate and has us touch everything until the game tells you you've touched enough. It's the worst part of playing the game for me, but there isn't much filler here. If they had to go down this route, and I suppose maybe they did with it being a game about a detective, made by a studio who made games about other detectives, they at least knew how to execute it well enough and cut out the pointless tropes. We don't have any serious investigation of every discarded cigarette like LA Noire. Instead, our depressed, constantly tired war veteran uses this as an opportunity to crack snarky jokes at everything he looks at in these murder scenes. And I won't lie, this did make me like him more. These lines are dry and help lighten the mood of the most tedious gameplay here. But it did also suck me out of a game which is primarily built on its strong atmosphere and writing. But personally, I wouldn't have it any other way, because his lines were silly and I like things being silly. Even if he has to say a funny quip every time he sees a dead family. That being said, I'm not as kind to the silly jokes written all over the graves in the cemetery. I do draw my line there. Still, I'm not playing this game for mystery solving, it's just a necessary evil here that fits the stories and characters like a glove, even if it does interfere with the most enjoyable parts of the game. So in that regard, I guess this is just a third Condemned game. After we gather all the clues, we get ugly effects on our screen, and then get supernatural recreations of the events that took place here. This is just everyday life for our PI. We then have to figure out the order of these events to get the full picture. It's kind of like Danganronpa cases, except this is a fully 3D explorative space, so often the solution is just following the direction the characters are going in, and you don't have to critically think about it. Even if you get it wrong, there's no penalty, just do it again. Once again, I'm not here for this. Look, I know it sounds like the game was really unappealing, but the game really is great, and I'll explain shortly. It's just that the game does a lot, as some areas are inherently better than others. So let's look at the bits of gameplay that I do love. First, there's so much more detective work than a streamlined LA Noire. Perhaps my favourite aspect of this is searching the archives. It's built in such a way to basically make brute forcing it ineffective, and it does require some critical thinking. Across the map, we have city hall records, police records, newspaper archives, and a public library. And each of these behaves slightly differently, but essentially anytime we need to investigate further, we go to the appropriate location, i.e. a library for a book, the police station for reported crimes and arrests, and so on, and then we have to match our lead with 3 qualifiers like the time period, the district of the city it occurred in, and something else relevant like the type of crime or the section of newspaper this would appear in. It's fun figuring these out, and it gives the game enough depth to feel rewarding and complicated without bogging everything down. Once we link up the info, it gives us exactly what we need. We don't need to do any of the actual tedious bits ourselves. Investigating also happens on a lesser degree with your lack of set waypoints. The game will tell you where to go, but only in ways like saying, oh, it's a building in this district, it's on a certain street between 2 other streets, that's it. Go to your map, search for the area that corresponds to those directions, set your waypoint there, and go to that street until you find an enterable building. It's excused wonderfully in the universe because this town doesn't care about numbering their houses, because they know everyone here and they don't want to make it easy for newcomers. It's this odd level of being hands-off, while also not letting you get lost. It just requires a little bit of busy work, which I loved, and helped familiarise myself with all these streets and districts. I got better at finding locations the more I played, because I learnt this fictional messy town like I would a real-world location I would spend a lot of time in. It helps us avoid the game just being following a set of waypoints without any thinking, while also making it so we can follow a waypoint to our location. It's a great solution that in theory should please everyone, although I'm sure many people wouldn't like it. The only issue with this is on the few occasions there's multiple enterable buildings in the same area, but even then, just try them all until you get the right one. Do as the Oakmonters do. Speaking of slight inconveniences that I love, fast travel can only be done from and to various payphones in the city that you have to first find before you can use them. Once again, it helped immerse me in this tragic locale. If it isn't obvious, I don't mind working for stuff like this instead of instant gratification. And if that's not you, you should already know this game isn't for you. These fast travel points are frequent enough to avoid tedium, but they're spaced out enough that it's never taking you exactly where you need to go. And none of these payphones are initially on your map, you just have to stumble upon them as you explore, which is a nice incentive to take the long way. It'll save you time later on. A large bulk of this game is just running from point A to point B, then pinpointing the next location you need to go to, and then from there going to point C. Thrilling, I know, but it did hook me. Though the tedious fetch quests were the game at its absolute worst. There are optional side quests here that see you do nothing more than what I said earlier, and your only reward for it is reading things like journals. I liked reading these documents, but I can see why many wouldn't enjoy this part of the game. This is only for the kinds of people who want to soak in every single last detail of the world. Thankfully, the rest of the game is held up by a much stronger framework, with more rewarding things awaiting you. Whether it be the main story or the more fleshed out side quests, the writing never faltered and the atmosphere didn't dissipate either. Even if lots of interiors look close to identical, because the small indie team obviously had to reuse assets instead of making every building from scratch. More distractingly, this also applies to some NPC faces, and that's harder to ignore when you get in conversations with them. The game thrives in grey morality. Nothing is easily good or bad, outside the moments where you get to beat the shit out of or belittle the Ku Klux Klan. Look, our little private eye can just ask him to pull a rabbit out of his hat, because he shows no respect for this horrible, irredeemable person. Great moment. Charles Reed is the best. I know the idea of grey morality is a thing we're all pretty much tired of because we see it in so much contemporary media, and it's nice to see media that just depicts the hopeful instead of bleak tragedies. Though the way I see it, the issue is the amount of it and the execution of it, and not just doing it for the sake of doing it. That's tiring. And The Sinking City earns this completely. Plus it'd be weird to tell a Lovecraft story that wasn't so bleak and grey. Unless it's codenamed Steam, that's the exception. It'd be a disservice to show a moment on screen and just say, oh, this is my favourite moral choice. But I did often find myself sitting there for a few minutes trying to think of the actual lesser of the two evils. And even when I made a choice, I never felt quite good about it, clan attacking notwithstanding. For example, a particular quest involving the 1920s least evil mental health asylum in particular hurt me, and it was just a side quest. Don't skip all the side quests, the ones that open with a conversation are all amazing. This side content made me feel even worse for the woman whose mouth was sewn shut. I didn't know it'd get worse for her, but it did. I love her so much. She doesn't deserve all this. And when we get to main story missions, they are all essentially broken into a formula that ends with you piecing together clues and deciding which of the two different ways you want to end this. It can be deciding which of two characters to help, or which of the two characters has to die, or whether you want to help someone or kill them. Things like that. And the game makes wonderful justifications for why only these two choices can occur, and they always manage to feel like a well-earned bookend to each chapter. Don't expect a huge tangled web of choices. This is a series of binary choices that only slightly stack onto each other, but it's still impressively handled. These choices still feel meaningful, even when they barely impact the game itself. At the time, they feel weighty. And if we explore our hotel room, which you never need to do, we even get newspaper excerpts detailing what choice occurred and how it affected things we weren't privy to in the moment. And good old Charles Reed sometimes has disturbing hallucinations of those he either killed directly or indirectly. On a minor note, he can often get hallucinations during enemy encounters, though primarily it's with his little images smothered on the screen which lose their charm very quickly. But it's just a good reminder that your sanity is dropping, because this game of course has a sanity system, though it is pretty superfluous here, and instead of being an integral thing we need to keep our eyes on constantly and combat, it's basically a second bar we need to watch and heal in addition to our health. Both health and sanity are healed in nearly identical systems, and this can be seen as disappointing, but they found a way for me to love this despite the obvious limitations. Everything in combat is slow and deliberate. It's early 20th century firearms against cosmic horrors. Reloading is slow, and most guns take longer to do that than you'd want. We can even lay down traps, which is the slowest thing in the world, and I love it. I bring this up because both our healing items have slow animations tied to them, and this means during more hectic moments, we need to create a lot of distance between us and all the enemies who want nothing more than to murder our PI. Having 2 meters here means this is even more hectic, especially since low sanity does make things, well, not ideal to put it lightly. This can be made much harder with separate difficulty options, one for combat and one for the detective stuff. I love seeing that. Now everyone can have a tailored difficulty experience just for them. If you're the kind of person that wants challenging puzzles and easy combat you can, or you can switch that around as well. But these combat sections are the most video game this video game feels. Shooting feels great. Gyro aim is fun even if I'm not good at it. We have a weapon wheel, which I will admit is one of the good innovations of AAA 7th generation games. And all the enemies are enjoyable to kill, even though there's not as much variety as I would like. We even get a few boss fights, which helps add slightly more variety too, though I could have done with more as well. At our disposal, we have a terrible pistol, a better revolver, a powerful shotgun, a deadly yet terribly slow rifle, and the Tommy gun, which is awesome until it runs out of ammo, which is all the time. And we also have Molotov cocktails and grenades for more flair. You gotta love a game that lets us start fires to kill enemies. We also keep a flashlight on our clothes at all times so we can balance seeing and shooting things effectively. Just ignore the fact that the light path follows his head and not his torso, that doesn't really make sense. Each weapon feels just right, and as you'd imagine, the more powerful they are, the more ammunition they consume. Most of your supplies, including ammo, have to be crafted, which is thankfully easy and can be done anywhere. It just means that you can very easily be low on supplies since you carry around a slightly believable amount of stuff, and the materials you need are basically scattered items in garbage cans that you then have to consume to have useful items. All these strict item limits can be slightly circumvented with a skill tree, which really does suck me out of a world here. Charles, the power to carry more ammo, was just a few enemy kills away. Still, even at its maximum, it's not a huge amount. So it's barely an issue. It's just that the idea of getting experience points and then magically learning how to increase your sanity or how to hold more items is just out of place here. Though him wearing an octopus on his head isn't, and I'll fight anyone who argues it is. Something slow which isn't deliberate is loading and accessing menus here, and I'm sure your mileage may vary on other systems that aren't the Switch. It's just that this is some of the worst menu speeds I've seen in a game like this. But to me personally, it was worth it to have this game on the go, warts and all. In fact, the other performance issues were charming to me, though I'm sure that wasn't the intent. I haven't seen texture pop in like this since the 3D GTA games on PSP, and it sometimes has to stop and load in if you've gone too far from what's currently loaded. But hey, if a new Zelda game can do that, why can't the Sinking City? The game's atmosphere is perhaps at its very best during the slow underwater sections, which are few and far between, to avoid overstaying their welcome. But each time you do it, it's a fun, horrifying treat. Charles will don an old diving suit and walk on the ocean floor. You feel so helpless as your movement is slowed dramatically, and the only weapon that you have is a very slow harpoon gun, which can only stun the water beasties. There's not much to say here since these moments are short and linear, but for what they are, the execution is perfect. I told you the game wears many different hats, and for me it did its best with all of them. It's a concoction of blended mechanics and styles that click with me, even though I can see the budgetary and development seams all the time. This isn't the most fun, modern 3D game I've played by any stretch, but it was perhaps the most engaging, and I can only hope Frogwares continue this quality and improve it even further as they get more familiarity developing their style. Another game where the devs learned from their mistakes is Conker's Pocket Tales, the next game I'm covering. Thanks to the long development of 12 Tales Conker 64, this sister game on Game Boy became two separate games, one for Game Boy and one for Game Boy Color. Both versions of this game released on the exact same cartridge. It's an oddity for both the hardware and the Conker series as a whole, since these are the only full games that released with the cutesy family-friendly squirrel, plus it's the only games to feature the menacing honker and evil acorn.